All right, so you've brought us quite the collection of sources for this deep dive. We've got online forum posts, some scanned documents, even a few newspaper articles. Looks like we're going deep into the world of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
It is a really interesting mix, isn't it? I mean, it gives us so many different angles to look at this movement that's been, well, it's attracting a lot of attention.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to pin down from what I've seen so far. So, from your perspective, like, what should we be focusing on as we go through all of this material?
Well, I think understanding Chris Butler himself is absolutely crucial. Who is this guy who has inspired such devotion, but also generated so much controversy? And of course, we need to grasp the core beliefs and practices of the Science of Identity Foundation, the SIF, as it's often called. And probably most intriguingly, we have to examine the allegations swirling around them, separating fact from speculation, to really get a handle on what's going on.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, Chris Butler, where does his story even begin?
It all starts in the 1970s in Hawaii. He got involved with ISKCon, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the Hare Krishnas.
Ah, okay. And I'm guessing he rose pretty quickly within that movement.
Yeah, he was very charismatic. He attracted a really diverse following in Hawaii. I mean, farmers, merchants, even politicians and journalists were drawn to his teachings. What's wild is how politically active his followers became in the 70s. Like, can you imagine seeing Katyani Devi Dasi on a ballot instead of, say, Keiki Hoshijo?
Wow, yeah, that would definitely be a memorable campaign. So he's making a name for himself in Hawaii, but then he breaks away from ISKCon, right? Why is that?
Well, from what I've gathered from these documents, he eventually formed his own group. It seems he wanted to move away from some of the stricter practices of ISKCon, and that led him to establish the Science of Identity Foundation.
So that's the SEFF. Now, what about this other name I keep seeing, Misja Zaitani? Is that the same organization?
It is. It's the same group. The Science of Identity Foundation, or Misya Daitani in certain regions, draws heavily from the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition within Hinduism.
Got it. But then we have these accusations of the SIF being a cult, right? How does that square with them promoting themselves as this non-sectarian movement?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? That whole cult label.
Yeah.
Former members and critics often use that term, pointing to claims of manipulation and control within the SIF.
And some of those accusations get pretty specific in these sources, especially when it comes to money. There are claims that Butler and the SIF leadership used really manipulative tactics to pressure followers into donating a lot of money.
Yeah, there's actually this one pretty striking anecdote. It mentions Butler allegedly threatening to stop eating and die if his followers didn't give more financially.
Wait, seriously?
At least that's what one of these forum posts alleges.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's true or not, it definitely raises questions about, well, the power dynamics at play and the potential for exploitation within the group.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. And there are other accusations too, right? Like members feeling pressured to donate a huge portion of their income and even work for free for self-related businesses.
Exactly. Several former members talk about feeling pressured to contribute beyond their means, which, yeah, lines up with those cult accusations we were talking about.
Okay, so we've got potential financial manipulation. What else are former members alleging?
Well, one thing that comes up a lot in these sources is the issue of control and censorship within the SIF. Particularly, they talk about restricted access to information, like followers were allegedly forbidden from reading anything that wasn't approved by Butler himself, even materials related to Guru Tattva.
Guru Tattva. Sorry, remind me what that is again.
Oh, right. It's a Sanskrit term. It refers to the nature and role of a guru in spiritual traditions. Essentially, it's about understanding the qualities of a true spiritual teacher and how to tell the difference between authentic guidance and, well, potentially harmful influence.
So it's like they're discouraging followers from being critical of the whole idea of a guru.
That's what it seems like, yeah, at least according to these former members. They claim that any teachings or discussions that might question Butler's authority were completely off limits.
That's definitely a red flag for me. It's almost like they're trying to prevent members from developing their own critical thinking skills.
Yeah, you could say that. It points to a possible environment of isolation where members are only exposed to very specific viewpoints, which, is something you see in a lot of groups accused of being cults.
Okay, so you've got potential financial manipulation, information control. Are there any allegations of outright abuse?
There definitely are. There are accusations of mistreatment, both emotional and psychological, by SIF leaders. One name that pops up a lot in these online forums is Lalita Siamdasi.
And who's that?
She's a leader within the SIF, particularly prominent in the Lublin Center in Poland. Several individuals describe pretty negative experiences with her, claiming she uses her authority in a harmful way. We'll have to dig into those specifics a bit later, but it's definitely another recurring theme we're seeing in these accounts.
So we've got potential financial manipulation, information control, and alleged abuse. This is getting heavy. But then there's this whole other level of alleged criminal activity, right? Questionable business practices and even accusations of drug dealing.
Yeah, some of these allegations are really serious. The SIF is accused of involvement in drug dealing and this multi-level marketing scheme called QNet.
And didn't one of the SIF leaders actually get caught up in that QNet scandal?
He did. Acharya Das, a high-ranking SIF member from Australia, was investigated for financial irregularities and fraud connected to QNet in Chennai, India.
It seems like the SIF has its fingers in a lot of pies, and some of them seem pretty shady. But we do have to acknowledge the other side of the story here. There's this completely different perspective from Tulsi Gabbard, the former U.S. Congresswoman. She's a known follower of Butler, right? And she's been very vocal in defending him and the SIF.
Absolutely. Gabbard has publicly supported Butler, saying she's grateful for his teachings and denying any allegations of hate speech or negativity within the SIF.
She even said she's never heard him say anything hateful or say anything mean about anybody.
Right. And that creates a huge contrast. On the one hand, we have these serious allegations from former members, and on the other, we have this prominent public figure offering really strong support for Butler and the SIFF.
So how do we make sense of those two totally different narratives? It's hard to know who to believe.
It's a real challenge. It just highlights how complicated it can be to figure out what's really going on in these situations when you have such drastically different accounts. It reminds us that truth can be elusive, and it's really important to consider all sides of the story before forming an opinion.
I think it's a good point to maybe take a breath. We've laid out a lot of groundwork here. We've introduced Chris Butler, the Science of Identity Foundation, and this first wave of controversies. But there's definitely a lot more to unpack. Are you ready to dive deeper?
Absolutely. I'm ready when you are. There's still so many fascinating threads to follow, especially those related to the role of fear within the SIFS and the significance of Butler's sannyasa vows.
You've got me hooked. Let's keep going. You know, as we're digging deeper into all these sources, one thing that really stands out is the role of fear. It seems to be everywhere, like this underlying current, for both the followers of the Science of Identity Foundation and, weirdly, even for Chris Butler himself.
It's really interesting you pick up on that. It's a thread that runs through all of these accounts. You see former members talking about feeling pressured, almost trapped, afraid of what would happen if they left the SEF. Some even say they were completely cut off, excommunicated, just for questioning Butler or having doubts.
It's kind of creepy when you think about it. And then you have that weird story about Butler having a trap door built into his house. Apparently it was an escape route if he felt threatened. I mean, that's pretty paranoid, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
You don't usually think of someone who is revered as a spiritual leader, a guru, being that afraid of, well, anything.
It makes you wonder about the psychology of it all for both the leader and the followers. I mean, is it like a cycle or something? The followers are kept in line by fear, while Butler himself might be driven by his own anxieties and fears, projecting them onto the group.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the trapdoor, it's almost like a physical symbol of that inner fear. It really makes you think about how power works within a religious group. If fear is the main way they control people, can it ever really be a healthy environment for anyone?
Definitely something to think about. Okay, let's switch gears for a second. There's a lot of talk in these sources about Butler's sannyasa vows. Can you explain to our listener what those are exactly and why they're important in all of this?
Sure. Sannyasa is a stage of life in Hinduism where a person gives up everything worldly to fully dedicate themselves to spiritual practice. They take vows of celibacy, detachment from possessions. Basically, they completely leave their normal life behind. It's a path for those who are seeking really deep spiritual understanding.
So it's not something you just decide to do one day.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. It's a big commitment. And Chris Butler did actually take these sannyasa vows. But, and here's where it gets interesting, he later breaks those vows by marrying Wailana, his partner.
Wait, hold up. He took vows of celibacy as part of sannyasa, and then he got married.
Yep, that's exactly what happened. And traditionally, if you break a sannyasa vow like that, you're supposed to give up the titles and name that go with that stage of life. But Butler kept using the title Paramahamsa and his sannyasa name, Siddha Swarupananda.
So he's still presenting himself as this renunciate, even though he's married and, from what we've read, has quite a bit of money.
Right, and that's been a huge source of controversy. A lot of people see it as hypocritical. I mean, the traditional idea of sannyasa is all about simplicity, detachment from material things.
It's like he's trying to have it both ways, you know? Taking advantage of the spiritual authority of sannyasa while living a life that seems to go against everything it stands for.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And this whole controversy over his vows, it ties directly into another interesting aspect of the Sif, their stance on Guru Tattva, that concept we talked about earlier.
Oh, right, right. The whole study of the nature of a guru. Why is that so relevant here?
Well, there are a lot of former members who claim that the Sif actually discourages, even forbids, people from studying Guru Tattva.
Why would they do that?
Some people think it's a way to protect Butler from being questioned. If his followers don't have a good understanding of what a true guru is supposed to be, they're less likely to question his actions or why he's still using the sannyasa title after breaking his vows.
So it's like they're controlling the narrative, making sure their followers only get information that supports their view of Butler.
Exactly, and it goes back to that theme of information control we talked about earlier. By limiting access to certain teachings, they can, in a way, keep a tighter hold on what their followers believe.
It's fascinating how all of this connects, this web of control and manipulation. But we have to remember, a lot of what we're talking about is based on accounts from former members, people who left the SAF. So they might have their own reasons for saying these things.
You're right. We need to be aware that there are multiple sides to this story, and it's not always easy to know what the absolute truth is. While there are these serious allegations, there are also people who genuinely believe in Butler's teachings and find the Sif to be a positive force in their lives.
So how does our listener make sense of all of this? It's a lot to process.
It is, yeah. That's where critical thinking comes in. This deep dive isn't about telling anyone what to believe. It's about giving you the information, showing you the complexity of it all, and encouraging you to think critically about it.
I like that. We're not trying to give definitive answers. We're just trying to help people understand. So, what's next? What else should we look at to get a better understanding of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation? So here we are, the final part of our deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. We've really gone deep down the rabbit hole with all of this, from Butler's early days with the Hare Krishnas to those, well, unsettling allegations about the stuff. It's been really thought-provoking, to say the least.
It has. It's been quite a journey. And I think it's a good time now as we're wrapping things up to kind of zoom out a bit,
Yeah.
step back from the specifics and think about the bigger picture. Like, what can we actually learn from all this? Not just about Chris Butler and this stuff, but about, well, religious movements in general. What are the big takeaways here?
You know, one thing that keeps coming back to me is charisma. I mean, Butler, he was obviously a very charismatic guy, right? He attracted all sorts of people, a diverse group of followers who were clearly very devoted. But, charisma can be a tricky thing. It can be used for good or for bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Charisma on its own, it's not inherently good or bad. It's just, well, it's a quality that can be used in all sorts of ways. The hard part is figuring out how it's being used.
Yeah.
Is it being used ethically to inspire people to help them grow, or is it being used to manipulate and control?
It's like, what is it? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. When someone has that level of charisma, they can end up with a lot of power. And if they're not careful, if their intentions aren't good, that power can be misused, right? And in a religious group, it's even more intense because it's often tied to this idea of spiritual authority. Like the leader has this special connection to God or whatever, and that makes it easier for them to get away with things.
Exactly. And when that power is combined with things like, well, information control, manipulation, and fear, as we've seen alleged with Butler and the Seth, it can create a really dangerous situation. It reminds us that even in a spiritual context, even when we're talking about faith, we still need to think critically.
Yeah, for sure. Blind faith can be a really slippery slope, and I think this deep dive has made that crystal clear. It's so important to approach any belief system, any spiritual teacher, with a questioning mind. Ask questions, look for different perspectives, and trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
I couldn't agree more. We have to pay attention to those red flags, those signs that something might not be right. We talked about financial manipulation, information control, fear and intimidation, the potential for abuse. These are serious things. We can't just ignore them.
It's a lot to absorb, and I'm sure some of our listeners might be feeling overwhelmed or even a little disillusioned by all of this. But it's important to remember that this is just one case, one example. Just because we've seen these troubling aspects of the Seth, it doesn't mean that all religious groups or spiritual leaders are bad, right?
Right, that's a really important point. There are so many different paths to spiritual growth and happiness, and lots of them are perfectly healthy and positive. This deep dive, I hope, has just been a reminder to be careful, to be aware of the possibility of use, and to always put your own well-being and critical thinking first.
Very well said. Okay, I think it's time to wrap things up. We've looked at Chris Butler's journey, we've gone deep into the science of identity foundation, and hopefully we've gotten people thinking about some important stuff. It's been a fascinating and sometimes a little unnerving deep dive.
It has. And I hope it's made you, the listener, want to explore these topics more, to think critically about what you see and hear, to keep learning and growing.
Yeah, exactly. The journey of discovery never really ends, right? There's always more to learn, more to think about. So keep asking questions, keep searching for knowledge, and never lose your curiosity.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
And keep it curious. We'll see you on the next deep dive.